So good afternoon and welcome everyone. And thank you so much for joining to our fourth webinar from this PCRC's Research Capacity Building webinar series. These webinars aim to help community organizations better navigate different aspects of conducting their own research or using research to better inform practice. And today we have Dr. Shannon Franssen from a faculty member of Concord University's School of Community and Public Affairs. She has been teaching in the Community Economic Development Graduate Program and has extensive experience in community and nonprofit sector. And of course, I think who's better, to present herself so I'll just pass on the word to you, Shannon, and thank you so much for joining us. It's really great to have you here sharing your experience.
Yeah, and thanks so much for the invitation. And I'll just say that I don't have a PhD, so I am not an academic or a doctor in any way. But I do have a lot of experience in community organizing. So I've worked in the community sector for over 25 years, most of that here in Montreal. I think I'll leave it at that in terms of introductions for me, but I'd love to know who's joining us today. So for the folks who are here, if you want to just introduce yourself really quickly, if you can. So feel free to open your microphone and let us know who you are and what organization you come from, if that applies to you.
Okay, my name is Leon Llewellyn. I'm with Coordinates Black Community Association, and I'm also part of a new group, Black Art History Montreal. We're looking at the Black artists who have created works of art before before internet. So that's it. We're just at early stages of formation. The idea is to be able to archive some of the material, all of the material that we find, so that students, researchers, and so on can have access to that history that is not accessible or available right now.
Great, thanks.
Hi, my name is Amanda Ruggles, and I work for ACDPN, the African Canadian Development and Prevention Network in Côte-d'Ivoire and in the West Island. I'm the community liaison there, and yes, hello.
Hey, thanks for joining us. It's great.
Hi, my name's Candida. I'm actually not a part of a community organization. I'm a PhD student at McGill University conducting research on racial differences in healthcare. And I got the invitation to attend the webinar, so I've been attending, but I'm not a part of a community organization.
Great, thanks for being here. I think there might be one other person in the room, maybe not.
It's us, BCRC.
Okay, that's great. Okay, great. So yeah, it's good to meet you all. And I know some people will be watching this as a video. So if you're watching this as a video, thanks for tuning in. Today, we're going to talk about the fact that being right is not enough. So what I'm going to be presenting today is this idea that the outcomes of community-based research or of any research are not necessarily social transformation. And often having like the best argument or the best research is not actually going to lead to change. So what can we do as community-based researchers or people conducting research in the context of an organization or in the context of wanting to in the context of community development or social change work, how can we use research effectively so that it can contribute to change? So with that, I'm gonna, so we're gonna go ahead with the presentation. This presentation will be relatively short and will end with more of a discussion period. So it's going to be about 25 minutes long, and then we'll have a good long time to discuss after that. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to challenge some of our assumptions about the role of research in social transformation. We're going to talk about moving from knowledge creation to action or influence, and particularly the theory of change-based planning method for actions that are meant to be part of a social transformation kind of program or project, and community-based action research as a particular way of doing research. So we're going to touch on those two things really briefly. We're going to talk about knowing your target. So often when we're working in an organization that we have a goal or an objective of social change, there's often a target in particular that we're wanting to focus on. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And we're also going to talk about the importance of building counterpower. So to not forget that that we can also do other things to influence that's complementary to research, and can often actually move things further towards the social change that we want than research can, or that research can alone. And then we're going to have our discussion. So let's get into that. Any questions before we start? That's good. All right. Moving right along then. So the role of knowledge in social transformation. So often what I've found as a community organizer is that we kind of have this assumption that developing an accurate understanding of an issue or presenting the right arguments will in itself lead to change. So, you know, if we come up with just like really detailed understanding of why, for instance, there's barriers to healthcare for people who are racialized, then once we have that understanding, that in itself will all we need to do is present it, and then change will happen. Or if we have really well documented arguments on, for instance, like why we shouldn't allow a condo developer to develop condominiums in a certain neighborhood, we just present those arguments, and then magically, you know, the elected officials will be like, oh yeah, you're right about that. Yeah. Okay, well then we'll cancel that project. But often that really is not enough. And the example I like to cite is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, because I think this is a really, really excellent example of this. So for folks who don't know, there's a link in the presentation that I imagine will be available to everyone through the BCRC. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is something that's like created by the United Nations, and it's the body for assessing the science related to climate change. And they do an incredibly good job of this. There's just like an army of thousands of scientists across the world who are contributing to the knowledge that is sort of held by the Intergovernmental Panel, by the IPCC. And they have done a really, really incredible and extensive, very, very extensive and irrefutable job of showing that climate change is our reality, and helping us understand what the current risks are and what the future risks are and what we can do to mitigate those risks. Unfortunately, during the same time frame that the IPCC has been active, which is, you know, the last several decades, climate change has accelerated. The production of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that is going into the atmosphere has accelerated, and the problem is just getting worse. So the fact that knowledge is really well documented and that it is now irrefutable that climate change is happening has not been at all enough to have governments change and take measures to prevent climate change. And actually the contrary is happening, that it's getting worse faster. So this is a good example on how being right is not enough. And even with all the resources of the United Nations and an army of thousands of scientists with really the best arguments, this isn't what's going to tip the balance and tip the scales in terms of preventing climate change. So if we take that down to our contexts as, maybe individual community organizations working with very small budgets, we can see that this assumption, especially on a scale of, one organization or maybe a few organizations working together with very limited budgets and maybe very limited academic support as well, to think that what we're able to do in that context could really lead to social change is an assumption that's really worth challenging. So what's going on here? So why isn't having, the best knowledge and the best arguments what is going to influence decision makers? So we want to challenge this assumption with some experience that comes and some lessons that come from community organizing. So the reality is that that I have seen and that many other people are experiencing on all sorts of issues is that politicians and policymakers are often very aware of the issues. It's not that they don't know or that they don't see what the reality is or what the problem is. But the reasons for choosing the status quo and not making changes is often more about, what's in it for them and what their interests are before acting in the public interest. So it's like someone is benefiting from the status quo. And we need to understand what those benefits are and why things aren't changing before we assume that just the right arguments are going to be what is going to make them change. So if we take the example of climate change, we know, so we take the example of Canada, that, the petroleum industry has a huge influence on the Canadian government. And the petroleum industry has zero interest in acting on climate change that would be detrimental for them. And so we see that there are economic interests at play that keep the government from putting in place the actions they could put in place because it would involve dismantling the petroleum industry. And that is not going to happen because those are very rich and influential people. So it doesn't actually matter what all the scientists are saying. So, I'm making some shortcuts here, but you get the idea. So power is not necessarily, will not necessarily respond to good arguments. It responds when things align, when asks align with their interest often, or when citizens have pushed so much that they can no longer ignore them. So they've built enough counterpower that they can no longer ignore them. The other thing that I think is really important for people to hear, it also comes from a community organizing background, is that often politicians will send citizens off to research policy or to develop good arguments, because it's actually a very effective way of shutting down a social movement. Because doing that academic work or that research work or that policy development work is very time consuming and very hard. But people will often be like, oh, okay, I get it. Like, you just need the right information and then you're going to change. So I'll just go and do all that work for you, come back with it really well documented, and suddenly you'll change your mind. It is actually a good strategy on the politician side to get you to go away. Because then you're going to go away and spend a whole lot of time doing that research. So you need to be aware of that when you're making the choice to do research in the context of whatever social transformation goal that you have. So we're gonna go on. Hopefully you've got some questions generating here at this point, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. So when we're thinking of the role of social transformation in our projects, we want to think about how your research will lead decision makers to make the right decisions, and what is the role of research and knowledge creation in your projects, and to be really explicit about that. And one way to do that is by using sort of a theory of change model of planning or program planning. So you can learn more about this on the website theoryofchange.org. And I think this is a really good, in my experience, a really good way of planning out, any kind of program or doing kind of strategic planning in your community organizations or for whatever project you're working on, because the theory of change method allows you to challenge some of those assumptions about any kind of action you're putting into your plan, but specifically in this case about research and what role does it have in your overall goals. So the theory of change is, like I said, a way of doing strategic planning that involves a comprehensive description of how a desired change is expected to happen in a particular context. So it's sort of like it forces you to say, okay, when we develop knowledge about a certain thing, this will cause a certain other thing to happen. And it's focused in particular on mapping out what has been called sort of the missing middle between like an action and what an initiative is actually doing and how that leads to the desired goals being achieved. And basically how you do this is you think about your goals first. So say you have the goal of wanting, I'll just pick any kind of random goal I can think of that hopefully connects with some of the things that you are working on, the folks who are in this room. Say you want hospital administrators to change the way that they admit people into hospital so that we deal with some of the barriers to care for racialized people. And particularly say we're wanting to do this for Indigenous people in Quebec. We want to change how they treat them when they come in for triage so that we can be sure that we're not reproducing some of the racist policies that we've seen and colonialist policies we've seen recently come to light in Quebec. So you're wanting maybe to change that. So if that was part of your goal, you would state that explicitly, and then you would work backwards, like what is going to have the most influence on that particular problem. And maybe along the way, you would come to the conclusion, like doing research about this is going to be important in order to present to hospital administrators so that they change the way they do things, but maybe you wouldn't. So you would basically not embark on a kind of research process until you've done that theory of change and can really clearly articulate why and how the research is going to lead to the social transformation that you're working towards. So if your research is the right action, you will be able to explain how it's going to work, how that research fits in. So another thing I'm wanting to talk about in terms of how research can be used in a kind of community-based context. So there's, first of all, making sure you have an articulated theory of change that your research is fitting into, so you can really clearly describe why you're doing this research and how it's going to lead to change. And the other thing I want to mention is community-based participatory action research as a method, or as kind of a way of doing research. So what is this? I've taken this from community-based participatory action research by Wilson, and there's lots of other resources available on what this is. So it's an equitable research approach that is operationalized within a social justice framework. And it's a kind of approach that blurs the distinction between researchers and research participants. And so it's kind of like research that is done by and for people who are affected by a certain problem. The nice thing about this approach is that it can minimize power imbalances between the people who are doing the research and the people who the research is about. So the idea is that it would actually be by and for the people who are going to use this knowledge. What this often, like this approach is particularly nice in the context of a theory of change framework because it allows the goals of the research to be articulated by the people who are working towards that change and for the people who are working towards that change. So you can make sure that your research questions, your research goals fit into that framework. Instead of it being defined, say, by an external person who's an academic at a university and who has their own goals and their own, their own career that research is fitting into. So also researching in partnership with communities towards positive community outcomes that are sustainable beyond the life of the research is the idea here, so that it really does contribute to action within a community. And here is a great book that I would highly recommend about doing this. So do-it-yourself social research, which is written sort of for people who are working in community organizations who have research questions that they've determined that like doing that kind of research will help them with their social transformation goals. So how do you do this? So it's written really for people who are not academic researchers, but want some answers and want to produce some knowledge so that their own actions can be more powerful. So I highly recommend this book as a place to start in terms of determining your research questions and your research design. Okay, now we're going to shift a little bit to the idea of knowing your target. So I'm adding this in here because as you're, say you're working with an organization that does have a theory of change, they've clearly articulated why they want to do certain kind of research, they've got their research questions, they've got their research design. An other important thing when you're really finalizing that research design is to understand, like, who are you producing this for? So who do you want to be consuming your research at the end of the day? And that will change how you present it, and what kind of language you use, or what you do with it. So here's a few targets or decision makers that are often like involved in things we want to change. So things we want to be different. It can be health institutions that we want to adopt a different kind of policy. It can be the municipality, the city, that we want to do things, that we want them to do things differently, or we want politicians to make decisions that are going to affect our communities, and we're trying to convince them to make a certain kind of decision. It can also be funders, because we're doing this research so that we can get funding to do the good work that we do. And if you're presenting research to, say, a doctor at the public health department, you're going to present this very differently than you would to say the board of directors of the McConnell Foundation, or whatever person that you're talking to at this funder who you're trying to convince to give you money. Or the private sector can also be the target. So land developers or small businesses or chamber of commerce, particularly land developers, I find in community development, are often a target. We're trying to get them to back off. We're trying to get them to do things differently. And arguments that influence those kind of business people are very different than arguments that might influence a municipality or the public health department or that kind of thing. And you might have ideas. Also, this list is very much not complete. It's just a few ideas from my recent experience of who has been targeted by some of the community-based research projects that I've worked on in the past few years. So I have a question for you, is like, who else? Who else are we targeting? We're going to just finish up with the presentation, and then I hope you have some answers. Who is your target for the kinds of research that you're working on? Okay, last couple of slides. So here's a really important thing as well. In my experience is that, you'd be doing research as part of, say, your theory of change framework, but there are other things going on as well. And there are other parts of that framework that involve having influence on the decision makers in a particular of whatever you're working on. And we need to remember that building counterpower is a different type of action. So usually research is about having the right arguments, and complementary to that can be actions that are that focus more on showing a decision maker that the community is not going to go away and the community has backing. So I like to talk about this as building counterpower. So how do we do this? And these are things that have nothing to do with research, but can often use the results of community-based research to make them more legitimate, or to make these actions more legitimate, or to give them kind of like the argument that goes with it. So using, so what are the things that you can do to build counterpower? So it can be using legally binding agreements with enforceable consequences. So this can be something like a community benefits agreement that you're signing with, you know, a property developer, which will be, once it's signed, have a legally binding quality to it. And you might use your research to say, okay, here's why we want this agreement, but the action is still signing that agreement. And the research alone won't get that done. You have to push to have that be something that you can do, or that the developer is willing to sign. So things you can do, but sort of credibly threatening to oust political leaders or align with the opposition leaders. So this is like putting pressure on politicians. So again, often the research can be about like, okay, why are you doing this? What is your argument? But you still need to have, you know, enough people showing that they are not going to vote for that politician unless they do, you know, X policy change, or unless they develop whatever policy. And that is mobilization. So it's your research alone isn't going to do that mobilization, but they go hand in hand. There's also withholding social acceptability, or threatening credibility, or loss of revenue, or political status, or the institutional kind of like challenging the institutional mandates. So this would be something like, say, the city wants to develop a certain area, wants to develop condominiums. Well, you can show that the community really, really, really doesn't want this. That again is mobilization. You have to show that there's, you know, enough people who are really not accepting what they're doing. And again, your research can explain why, but you still have to do the mobilization work. And then there's also the kind of mobilization that significantly disrupts operations. So that's like, you know, union walkouts, striking, boycotts, occupations, sit-ins, things like that. That can make politicians and decision makers notice what you're doing, and then you can have your arguments ready for why you're doing it, but you're still doing that mobilization to put pressure on them. And we have arrived then at the discussion part of this. So I've said a lot of things. Really interested in how the things that I've been talking about are making you think about your research and your research projects. So what about your project? And do some of the things I've said make you think differently about how and why to use research in social transformation? So it's over to you now, folks who are in the room. So just go ahead and open your microphone if you have something to say. Any first thoughts?
It seems everybody's a little bit shy today. Or I don't know, or tired, or you needing a coffee, or there can be many. Well, I can go ahead while people are kind of maybe thinking. I thank you so much. I found your presentation very interesting, and I'm coming a little bit from the opposite. I was more in the academy, and now I'm getting more and more involved in the community. Community research, community-based research, although I did work as a consultant and was doing all kinds of research for community for non-profits or for government institutions and so on. So anyway, what I wanted to maybe to mention is interesting. I would like to hear a little bit more how theory of change can connect to building recommendations at the end of kind of your research, and when you have to report to these organizations and all. For me, the most difficult part was always coming up with recommendations. So it's like you have the research, and then how do you translate that research into very objective like recommendations? And of course, this is related also to targets, like you just mentioned. I don't know if that makes sense, if you can comment on that, Shannon.
Yeah, so I think that actually for any group that is considering embarking on you know, like a substantial research component to their action, I would really recommend doing sort of a theory of change planning process before you go into it. So like I said, when I was really briefly explaining what that is basically what you do is you say at the beginning of the process, okay, here's what we want to be different, like in say 3 years or 1 year, or however many years your program is going to be operating. So here's what we want to be different. So in the context of like I don't know, is there maybe a particular example of a research that you've been working on, or a research project you've been working on that, you know, we could say what is the change you're working towards?
Well, not precisely at the moment. I don't know. I can remember the last like one job was about the results of like climate change, and so it was a disaster, natural disaster that affected more, and we were doing, me and my colleague, researching for UN Women, and so basically focused on women's needs after this disaster. You know, of course, you have the housing needs, you have the nutrition, whatever, but just the fact of coming up with these kind of recommendations that are useful, you know, and how that can connect, how you thinking with theory of change can help you towards, you know, that end goal, maybe.
I can
so
actually
that's what they're
oh,
gonna
sorry.
read. Sorry, that's like the most important part of the report, is like the introduction or the executive summary, and then recommendations. Sorry, I think it was Amanda.
Yeah, it's Amanda here. Hi. So it's interesting because we're going through the theory of change process right now. We're coming to sort of the more applied section where we've ended it, and now we're going into the actual action-based part of it. And the thing about it is that what I like about it is that I think you touched on it a little bit on the systemic perspective. So when you are doing your theory of change, you're looking at all the systems that are having an impact on your community, on your research, and on your community organization. And so when you kind of go through that process over and over again, you really start to understand how to rethink your research and how it's going to impact the work you do, how it's going to impact the systems around you. So, you know, it could be working with the CUS. It could be working with, you know, families, Black families who are having trouble accessing, who are having their challenges accessing healthcare, social services, all of that, and how it all interconnects. And, you know, you go through this process of constantly questioning your own assumptions and the assumptions of the system. And then it just, you know, as you do that, it starts to dilute. You start to dilute all of your questions and all of your perceptions and your assumptions. So it starts to get clearer and clearer. And that really helps identify, you know, how you want to present your research. I'm thinking, because we're not really involved at the moment in full-on research, but I think there's always that research perspective in what we do. And we are always, you know, looking for better ways of accessing research. And but I'm thinking of research not so much like academically, but much more like, how do we create best practices for the community that we serve? So more in like an action-based way. And then how do we bring that back to the systems around us in terms of policy change, in terms of the CUS and all of that, all of the systems that work for or against. I don't think that answers your question fully, but that's just our experience, or my experience at the moment, in terms of applying theory of change within the community organization and within the systems that we are working with.
Yeah, I think that it sounds like you're doing exactly, you know, what I was talking about, like the, you know, before you start developing your research question and your research design, you know, do this theory of change process and then see, is research even the appropriate thing? You know, like, does it even make sense to do it? And if so, you know, with what question and for what reason, and who are you going to present it to? Who's your target in the end? And how does it all kind of fit into what you want to change. So if we take the example of, say, women being affected by climate-related, natural disasters in a certain part of the world, we could think like, okay, what we need to know is all the ways in which women are affected. But then you kind of think like, okay, wait a minute, is what we need to know all the ways in which women are affected? Like, what are we trying to actually do here? So what are we trying to do? We're trying to make sure, I'm just going to make this up, but say your ultimate goal is make sure that women have access to everything that they need in order to like take care of their families. So say that is your goal. Maybe you already know enough about what they're missing and what their needs are, so you don't have to necessarily do an in-depth research in all the ways in which women have been affected by this, because the basics you already know. So you can skip the research part and go straight to the action. But there could be some cases in which you don't actually know things that you need to know about their needs, or about the situation, or about what's going to happen in the future. And you need more documentation. So then that will help you structure your research question, and then ultimately have a good design that then moves you toward that change that you're working towards. So I don't know if that makes it clearer.
For sure. No, yeah. Thanks. I just saw Leon has a question on the chat. So CDN-BCA does the theory of change every 5 years. It usually includes staff, administration, and board. It has been very successful so far, helping to set up our direction goals. So I just wanted to read that out loud if you want to comment. I think he can speak, Leon, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's great to hear. Because I think like one thing that I've really noticed, moving from working with sort of grassroots community organizations at a very local, in a very local context, and then moving towards working on climate change issues and working more in academia, is that in those fields, oh, someone in the reading room, I'm just gonna put them in those, in academia and in certain fields where academic work is very well respected and well regarded, there does seem to be this, and I mean, I think especially in academia, there's this assumption that just having answers is somehow going to change things. And so it's really great to hear that more and more groups are doing theory of change processes where we can really challenge those assumptions. And I would recommend also that in academia, some of that it becomes more part of the practice. Like, to really ask yourself, like, why are you doing the research that you're doing? And we tend to have this this idea in academia that knowledge creation is good in and of itself, but we do have a limited resources in the world. So asking yourself, well, why are you wanting to produce certain knowledge, is, I think, a really worthwhile question to ask. And the theory of change framework is a great method for answering that question. Any other thoughts?
I just had a thought around when you mentioned policy change in particular, how research can be used for or against, and how that's sort of like a very delicate, seems like that's a very delicate line that I actually hadn't thought of before. I don't know if you can say a little bit more on that, or maybe like best practices for community organizations who are trying to push for policy change, or speaking with public servants, and how to do that in the best way possible.
Yeah. My experience around policy change is a lot in sort of urban planning, and also a little bit in climate change related work. So I think there's a real connection between those two things, or some similarities that I assume is probably the case for lots of different kinds of fields that do policy change work. So what I have observed is that, and I kind of put it in the presentation, is that you know, there are usually reasons why politicians are not moving towards certain policy change that has like really nothing to do with their understanding of the problem, or their understanding of like the issue that could that could be positively affected, or that we could have a real impact on if we just changed certain public policies. So what I've learned is that you really need to understand whose interests are at stake. And there needs to be like an evaluation done and some thinking and some discussion to understand, to really understand that. So like a kind of power mapping, even like who's benefiting from policies being adopted or not being adopted. And you know, why are certain politicians really been defending the status quo? And that will lead you to like some answers around like, you know, how to move things, because whoever's interests are affecting policy is actually what you should be working on, and not necessarily developing like the best alternative policy. So I don't know if that, it sounds like a little bit abstract. I can maybe use an example. I mean, I did use the example of like the petroleum industry in Canada. You know, there's a lot of policies that the government could implement that would curtail the use of fossil fuels across Canada. They wouldn't be that complicated to implement, and it would seriously impact the emission of CO2 in our country. And those don't happen at the federal level, not because people don't understand it. Like people really, 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 really understand it. Like there's, like I said, just an army of scientists working on this. It's not, and the issue is not about understanding. The issue is about the interests of the petroleum industry. So unfortunately, what I have found is that many NGOs really focus on policy development, where they should be focusing on direct action and activism related to the petroleum industry. I don't know if that's an example that kind of brings that to light a little bit more.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it kind of comes down to like, you know, you need to think about why decision makers aren't making certain decisions, and sometimes that's going to mean like mobilization and not research. Sometimes it's going to mean, you know, getting in the way and disrupting power and not just having the best arguments.
Yeah, it's just it's really interesting, the discussion, the way, the direction it's taking. And for me, I was just thinking about the funding issue actually, and how, you know, I mean, like you mentioned also that, you know, telling people to go do research is also like a way to move them out of the way, or so to say, or get them busy while you're doing your own things. So who's, you know, like, okay, we have all this research and funding for research, but then it's not being you know, used in the best way. How do you look for funding, and how do you consider funding in this situation, in this context? I mean, if it makes sense, and if you have something you would like to add on that, Shannon.
Yeah, there might be people in the room who have more experience like looking for funding, particularly for research projects. That's not something I have a lot of experience in. I do have experience looking for funding for community projects. Often that involves showing that you've done a needs assessment, and a needs assessment is a kind of research. So I would say that like that's a kind of research where your target could be a funder, to be able to say, look, like we want to do this thing, we want to provide this program. We can show that in our community this program responds to a need. Here's how it's going to respond to a need. And so give us money for that. Unfortunately, you often need a bunch of money just to get there. So that can be quite difficult. But what I've also found is that, like, I did mention in the presentation that often, like, I've had this experience of having politicians in particular go and say, like, community development people, just go and show that, go and really well document that, people need social housing in your community, for instance. And so that will, like, spin off into a 2-year-long sort of portrait of the community needs around social housing that show that, oh yes, in fact, there's exactly 1,200 units of social housing that we need in this community. But you didn't actually need to do that. Like, the idea that social housing is required in your community at a certain level, you can justify without having the exact numbers, without having done the 2 years of needs assessment. Just be like, obviously, they're just, it's too expensive to live here, and so for a certain, just based on like a portrait that you can pull from StatsCan data, you can show that given the income level of people in the community, there must be, a certain need. And that's much simpler than going and trying to find, like, every single person who needs social housing and documenting that. So I guess that's what I would be careful of. Be careful of decision makers who tell you, in order to make this policy change, we need you to go and document in detail exactly what the need is. I would respond to them like, look, we know well enough, and now we need you to do something about it. So to not take that burden of showing a need onto your shoulders just because a politician tells you to do it. Because they know very well that smaller community organizations don't have the capacity to do that kind of research. Any other questions or thoughts at this time? Or anything else anyone wants to share about what they're doing research about and for?
Well, I guess I don't know. I don't have any other questions at the moment. I just want to thank you, Shannon, again, for this very how can I say, eye-opening? Sorry, I'm English is not my first language, so it's sometimes I'm thinking in Portuguese and then but it was very, very, I thought it was very interesting, and I'm sure it's going to be very useful also for the other people who will be watching this recording. And we'll be sharing the slides as well, the presentation, which you mentioned had some links there, and of course the reference of the manual or the book you suggesting, and so this is all going to be very helpful. So we have also thank you from Candida.
Thank you also.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, it's really my pleasure. I love to talk about these kinds of themes. And I came at a lot of these conclusions after having made lots of mistakes where a city councillor or a provincial politician would say, hey, we really need you to go and document in detail a certain thing and then come back and then we'll make that policy change, and then spending tons of sleepless nights and scrounging for resources to do that kind of documentation and policy analysis and propose new policies and propose a new community plan, documenting the heck out of all that, and then 2 years later coming back with all that all really well prepared and having the politicians say, oh yeah, no, we're not going to do that. That's great. You have a great idea. You have a great plan. You're this wonderful, wonderful work. We're totally not going to do that. So I hope that in your research lives and in social change work that you're doing, that you'll skip those steps, and be sure to complement, building counterpower with the research that you're doing in order to really make sure that it can be used in the service of social transformation to its maximum benefit.
Thanks again. So I guess we'll end here. Bye, everyone.
Yeah, have a great afternoon, everybody.
Yeah, bye.
Bye, and thank you, Shannon.